another Arabic Hour program with a distinguished guest, Dr. Wadie, with us from Boulder, Colorado. Dr. Wadie is a lawyer in the School of Law, and he comes with a tradition of a family who have stood for justice for the Palestinians, justice for any issue. And he comes well prepared. He has written several articles and authored many documents. We are in the West, but particularly in North America, the United States and Canada, facing a new regime where people are worried about speaking up for justice for what they believe, even when they are speaking in a very peaceful and orderly way. They're being targeted. The attempt here is to disenfranchise these people, is to delegitimize their position and denying them what is basically a fundamental constitutional right in the US and a charter right in Canada to speak up their mind. And this is more sinister because it's at universities. Universities are supposed to be bastion, areas of safe political discourse for people where they can feel and are encouraged to speak up, to express their views. But increasingly, we are set back to even the days in the 60s when students were activists against the war in Vietnam. And now they're feeling the same things. Intelligence services, FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security, CSIS in Canada, they're basically and fundamentally pursuing these people, investigating them. We're living in a surveillance society, so to speak. And nobody can speak about this better than Dr. Wadie. You just authored a piece very recently with Anthony O'Rourke, and basically looking at what's happening here and how and in what way ADL and other groups are targeting Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, in a way that fundamentally threatens their basic human right and safety. They're threatening them with terrorism, aiding a terrorist organization, just for this minor issue of speaking up their mind, standing for justice, objecting to the onslaught the Israelis have been carrying on daily basis in Gaza, where now the number of children and women killed is in the thousands, over 12,000, and maybe even more. The numbers are increasing on daily basis. The total is above 25,000. The wounded is above 60,000. And the people who are starving, homes that have been destroyed is in 70, or some people even put 80%, that people really are being threatened to be transferred, to be thrown out of their birthplaces, of where they live, of where they work. So without further ado, Dr. Wadie, what was your basic beef that prompted you to write this article, and what did you find in terms of what the FBI, the DHL, and the prodding of the ADL, and some universities, as you mentioned, whether it's Columbia or Brandeis or Pennsylvania, have already, suspended the student organization, Students for Justice in Palestine, and others, and have declined to show documentaries that are critical of Israel. And what is probably the worst part of it is that this complete conflation of criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. So I leave it up to you. Where would you like to start? How would you characterize what we're going through now?
So, yes, thank you, Dr. Atif, for the introduction, the kind introduction. And I think, that with respect to the article is one thing and the general situation is another. I mean, I think specifically with respect to the article, my co-author, Anthony O'Rourke, who teaches at the University of Buffalo Law School, actually, I he ended up getting he and I ended up getting put in contact with each other because he was looking to write a piece about this, conflation of Palestine advocacy on campus with, or it being subsumed under the heading of potential material support to a foreign terrorist organization. And so he wanted to have a co-author who could speak to the material support area, the material support law and what that means. And he was I think quite well versed on the idea of repressing speech on campus and the kind of legal ramifications of that. So we collaborated on the piece after being put in touch by a mutual colleague, and it ended up coming out in Dissent magazine. And I think it speaks to the fact that because I read the news that the ADL and the Brandeis Center, which is not affiliated with Brandeis University, by the way, had written a letter to the government basically urging the FBI to conduct material support related investigations of pro-Palestine advocacy on American campuses, which I read that with great alarm. And he did too. I mean, I don't think this is the kind of thing one reads and sort of, remarks on it like, as if it were something innocuous or something, pleasant, like an exhibit of a particular painter at the museum or something like that. It was kind of terrifying to think that here you have non-state actors in the United States, right, with a vested interest in particular points of view, advocating that people be investigated by the FBI, which carries with it a kind of a stigma, carries with it intrusion, carries with it the potential for being exposed to, criminal liability, or at least, the fact of the investigation alone is enough to chill people and I think vilify certain types of speech, certain types of advocacy, to the point where people will feel chilled. And I think that was part of the intention of the ADL Brandeis Center letter. So, I think it's interesting that someone completely unrelated to me, who I don't know, who, I don't believe has a strong background in Palestine advocacy and is certainly not of Palestinian origin, was alarmed enough by this development to kind of reach out to see if there were people out there who felt compelled to, or felt, kind of encouraged, inspired to maybe speak out against it. So I think the fact of the piece, in Dissent, represents an understanding that there are many people who are alarmed by what the situation in the Middle East and the attack on the current assault on Gaza has produced by way of backlash here in the United States, especially on campus, right? Especially as it relates to campus speech, which is, and this is, by the way, it doesn't take place in a vacuum. There's clearly decades, as you very well know, from before my time, even the fact that discussing Palestine in a kind of a dispassionate manner involving facts and kind of making arguments based on the reality of the situation there, that's long been a charged subject in the United States on university campuses. And before October 7th, there were many debates related to this, especially in light of I think in 2005, the call by Palestinian organizations to engage in tactics of boycott, divestment, and sanctions on Israeli institutions. And, that has prompted a whole series of laws in the United States on the state level and attempts on the federal level to kind of render boycott activity as a violation of state law, which again is a dangerous development given the fact that the Constitution and the Supreme Court have recognized that the Constitution allows for the right of peaceful boycott. So we were already in a kind of a legally fraught zone when it came to Palestine advocacy and the nonviolent tactic of BDS. So the post-October 7th world has rendered the discussion even more charged, even more fraught, and we've seen even more heavy-handed tactics from pro-Israel groups to crack down on speech in this area. What kind of speech, who is targeted, is obviously of a certain ilk, of a certain type. And it's that selectivity and the idea that this is giving rise to a kind of a double standard that has engendered so much opposition, not just from Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims, et cetera, but from many different groups throughout society, across the board.
Yes. I mean, one thing you mentioned, chilling. I mean, the story is not just, scaring people. The charge here could bring out 20 years of imprisonment. I mean, this is not a minor, it's a criminal offense. It's not a simple measure, and people ought to take it seriously. And already, as we know, in several universities, people are now prevented from studying abroad. There are penalties, there are vindictive measures taken against people who dare to speak, so to speak.
Well, the issue with respect to material support in particular, I think we have to be, in this instance, I mean, in all instances, I'm probably more careful than the average person, but in this instance, let's be careful, because the likelihood that individuals on American campuses, or in the United States in general, the likelihood that individuals are providing material support to banned foreign terrorist organizations, here the implication is probably Hamas or the Islamic Jihad movement in Palestine, which the United States has designated as foreign terrorist organizations. And what that means is the Secretary of State makes that finding based on a series of factors, usually the findings are threefold. One is the group is foreign, two, it engages in terrorist activity, and three, that terrorist activity impacts the United States in some manner, right? It doesn't have to be directly attacking the United States. It could be influencing the foreign interest relations of the United States. So based on that finding, a group is designated, and that's not something you or I or anyone else can challenge. It's purely within the purview of the Secretary of State. And as a result, an individual, wherever they're located, right? They don't have to be in the United States, anywhere in the world, is prohibited from providing material support. Material support being not just money, although when the law was passed in 1996, so well before the September 11th attacks, it was justified under the idea that terrorist groups were supposedly raising money in the United States under cover of humanitarian activity. And because of that, the idea was that money for humanitarian activity frees up money for violence, for weapons and bombs, et cetera, because after all, money is fungible. But over the years, the material support law has kind of expanded, and the concept of material support itself has grown to the point where in 2010, the Supreme Court of the United States said that material support in the form of speech can be criminalized. Yes, if it's done at the behest of or in coordination with a foreign terrorist organization. So, yeah,
sorry,
go ahead.
But that's exactly the point, at the behest and in coordination. I mean, when somebody speaks up and totally independently and voicing their criticism, this is a personal thing. This is a right of an individual to. There is no way you could insinuate or without evidence show that it is in coordination or on the behest of the people. How would you prove that your position is independent and has not been coordinated or not on behest? Is there who has the burden of proof here?
So, I mean, when the government charges someone, obviously they bear the burden of showing all these elements beyond a reasonable doubt. And, I think the Supreme Court did make clear in that case in 2010, it's called Humanitarian Law Project versus Holder, where it found that material support in the form of speech can be criminalized as long as it's done in coordination or at the behest of a group. But it did make sure to say that independent advocacy, like you were referring to, remains protected. So you can speak out on behalf of a terrorist organization as long as you don't, as long as it's independent. Now, proving that is a different issue in that there isn't much case law on this, right? There was a case from over a decade ago involving a fellow, I think he was in Boston at the time. His name was Tariq Mahanna. And he was basically convicted of providing material support to Al-Qaeda by running a series of websites. And he tried to say, look, I wasn't in contact with the group. I didn't know who the group was. I mean, he made a particularly, I felt, compelling argument that this was not material support in coordination with or at the direction of Al-Qaeda, a banned foreign terrorist organization. But the jury didn't believe, the jury didn't buy his story and he was convicted. Other than that case, there hasn't been that much in terms of material support in the form of this type of, speech as a service or expert advice or assistance or things like, things that speech would fall into, because the alarming thing in the Supreme Court case, the 2010 case, was that the Supreme Court said, if someone wants to help a foreign terrorist organization become less violent and use, say, international law and peaceful means to advocate for their cause, they can still be prosecuted. Okay. Yeah. And so that's, I think, the one of the more kind of remarkable aspects of this discussion. But still, the idea of coordination remains very, vital to any type of charges being brought, and the government does bear the burden of proving it. Now, obviously, so I think in the abstract, the ADL Brandeis Center letter urging these types of investigations, to me, lands more like a harassment tactic than an actual, statement of any type of knowledge that that Hamas and other Palestinian groups that are on the FTO list are actually receiving support from students on U.S. campuses. There's a great deal of what I would call conflation of all these issues in legally a manner that's not very kind of, I think, salient to the discussion. But as a harassment tactic, when you say to the FBI, please investigate, the FBI already has a record of investigating Palestinian advocacy throughout the country, especially in the last 20 plus years, post September 11th, but even before that, right? Even before that, there were several cases involving, trumped up immigration charges, exaggerated criminal charges, to the point where, where I would think it's entirely within the realm of possibility that the FBI would do this. And to my mind, the fear is maybe less that, that people would be charged with material support, because I think maybe luckily the bar is set pretty high, and student advocacy on campus, or even faculty advocacy on campus, isn't rising to the level of material support. But at the same time, it can also, the FBI can find other things, right? And there's a famous situation involving an investigation of Palestine advocacy in the Chicago area, which didn't produce any terrorist-related charges, but it did result in the prosecution and denaturalization of a well-known Palestinian Arab American activist in the Chicago area named Rasmia Wadie, who was charged with criminally with lying on her naturalization application. And that issue was litigated because she had been tortured by the Israelis and imprisoned for an attack that took place in Jerusalem in the early 70s that left 2 people dead. And she made some arguments about how her confession to the confession in quote unquote to the Israelis was the product of torture. And I think it was a very strong argument that she had been tortured, and that's what caused her to leave out the fact that she had been arrested, because she said she didn't understand the naturalization form. She was charged with lying on her naturalization form by saying she hadn't been arrested. And her lawyers were making a very strong point about how she had been tortured and didn't understand the question in the same way, didn't consider her arrest by the Israeli authorities to be an arrest within the confines of this question, within the sort of the general understanding of this question, and talked about her experience. And what ended up in that case was, the issue was continuing to be litigated. And meanwhile, the government decided to drop those charges and then just basically say that she was deportable and inadmissible. She was inadmissible to the United States when she came here originally because she had been affiliated with a foreign terrorist organization, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. And that was much harder for her to argue, that she hadn't been affiliated at all. I think the whole point of that case was that, and it's a kind of a very stark warning that, individuals, that once the FBI starts an investigation, it can target individuals, and that there are many laws on the books that can basically put people legally in a very difficult position, even if they're beloved, community activists who have a very great reputation in the community in which they operate. But there are many laws at the disposal of the federal authorities. So when outside groups make a call for this type of investigation, they know what they're doing, and then they know that they're, maybe the issue in this instance of material support is unlikely or far-fetched, but they know that it could lead to other types of action that can chill speech, which is, I think, the goal of the ADL and the Brandeis Center here.
Absolutely. You mentioned something which is quite interesting in your research, that 25% of the foreign terrorist organizations are Palestinian or Arab. This is a very high percentage. And what you note also is that Al-Qaeda is not included in this. So
it wasn't. Yes. So originally, in the first iteration of the list that came out in 1997, it was close to, I think, 30% of groups were either Palestinian, or in the case of the Lebanese group Hezbollah, they were, their main goal was fighting the Israelis. So there was this concept of, Palestinian armed resistance to Israel, or Lebanese armed resistance to Israel, was, the source of 30% of the world's terrorist organizations, which is, I think, an incredible statement. And it even predates and takes precedent over the fact that Al-Qaeda, which is a group that attacked the United States on more than one occasion, even before September 11th. There was an attack in 2000 in the Gulf of Aden on an American Navy ship called the USS Cole that resulted in many fatalities, and an attack in 1998 on the U.S. Embassy in Nairobi and also in Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, which resulted in hundreds of casualties. And that group was not on the first iteration of the terrorist list, which is, I think, speaks volumes of the place of Palestinian armed activity as kind of quintessentially terroristic in the American mind, certainly on an official level.
I mean, there is always quite a contentious point here, is that you choose to label certain organization a terrorist organization when in fact many of these have declared that their objective is liberation from occupation, inalienable right to resist those who do you harm. The issue here, to a great extent, this heavy focus on the Palestinian issue, on the Arab issue, on the liberation movement. And the story is to what extent this has given ammunition to those who would like to silence the people. And as you said, like the divestment sanctions is non-violent, and in many respects is absolutely an alternative to violence in terms of resistance to occupiers and people who continue infringe on the basic human rights of Palestinians and Arab. So to what extent this argument of people that we are fighting an illegal occupation under international law, we are basically voicing our criticism of those who have violated international humanitarian law. I mean, look, what's happening in Gaza, no matter how much you strip it from all the political aspects, is ultimately the right of people to live, the right of people to live in their own homes, in their own places, and the extent to which these people are being eliminated and openly, and the statements about raising Gaza to the ground and transferring 2.2 million out of their homes is not made by some lunatic and infringed people, but by ministers in the Israeli government, by leaders in the Israeli society. To a great extent here, one is baffled. Why is in Canada, by the way, we're not that much different. That those who are defending Israel are not being called for all the infractions and all the disenfranchisement that they have been practicing on people who are trying to pinpoint and point and expose all these crimes, that it's their responsibility to uphold the international law, the human rights law, the international humanitarian law.
Well, I think so. I think on this issue, we have to kind of, basically recognize a couple of things. All right. Historically, the United States, both in law and policy, has never recognized a Palestinian right to resist the Israelis. Certainly not militarily, certainly not by violence. So on that position, which is one I don't share, of course, but that position has been, I think, relatively clear for a long period of time, that the United States, I mean, it's not simply, it's a much longer discussion, and I think it doesn't just sound in a defense of the Israelis and supporting their position. It also represents certain United States interests, in terms of it's the way it sees the world and the way it views military conflict and the application of what is known as the laws of war, or international humanitarian law. Because there was an effort internationally to recognize that certain groups like the PLO or the ANC are engaged in, kind of our anti-colonial liberation movements, who should be allowed to militarily resist their oppressors. And, there was a provision in the 1977 first additional protocol to the Geneva Conventions that recognized, certain non-state actors that are liberation movements have a right to engage in, armed resistance to their, and the U.S. never recognized that. It refused to. It has never signed that. It rejects that aspect of the Geneva Protocol, and that position has been consistent for the last, whatever it is, ever since the Palestinians emerged as a political actor and had an armed wing. It's always been rejected.
Yeah. But does or does not the United States consider Israel occupation of the West Bank as unlawful? It has accepted the UN resolutions, hundreds of them, that actually 1508, 1508 resolution that would consider the occupation of Palestinian land as illegal under international. Has or has not the United States accepted this?
No, the United States doesn't has, you remember very famously, especially, I mean, one of the things that maybe should have been a bigger warning sign to people when Biden became president was many of the actions of the Trump administration, right? He didn't counteract them. He didn't move the embassy back from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, right? Which indicates a certain recognition of America's view of Israeli sovereignty over Jerusalem, right? And the issue of settlements being illegal is kind of accepted under international law. The United States doesn't use that language. Even in previous administrations, it didn't use that language. It used the phrase, "they're obstacles to peace," right? But it was hesitant to say illegal under international law. And under the Trump administration, that issue of being obstacles to peace were kind of downgraded. So this is a sort of a legal, an area where the United States kind of disputes international consensus on this issue and kind of views the settlements not in the framework of international law, but in the framework of how do we reach a negotiated solution to the Palestinian issue, right? Which has taken the form of this very kind of overdone cliche of a two-state solution, which, fundamentally and substantively has almost no, kind of no content to it, no actual substance to it. So you're seeing that this is, that we're dealing with a situation, because let me give you one example here, just to underscore. You're dealing with a situation where the United States has never recognized the concept of a non-state actor to engage in armed resistance to its oppressor or occupier, except when the United States explicitly says it's okay, right? So this is a critical point, is that it's kind of, in the law, there's a famous case involving obscenity, and a Supreme Court justice responded about obscenity. Well, what's the test for obscenity? And he said famously, "I know it when I see it," right? That's the United States view of terrorism. It knows it when it sees it. It's kind of decides which groups are okay to engage in non-state violence and which groups are, basically not allowed to. And so it's a kind of a way of controlling the narrative, controlling the policy and legal ramifications here. And Palestinians have always fallen, outside what's deemed acceptable. And the material support law in particular. So there was a well-known case, one of the first prosecutions. There were only 3, by the way, or 4 that were brought before September 11th. And then after September 11th, there were, about 150 of these cases brought under the material support law. So one of the cases involved a Lebanese American guy from the Detroit area who was from the south of Lebanon, and he had gone to Lebanon, and he was stopped at Detroit airport. This is in the late 1990s. And he had stuff like night vision goggles on him, and not weapons per se, but material that could have a military use. And he basically said, "Yeah, I'm going to Lebanon to the south, and I'm giving this to the people who are, are fighting the Israelis, etc." He was pretty upfront about it. And so when he came back, when he came back from Lebanon, he was charged with providing material support to Hezbollah. And he tried to make the argument. The case had some twists and turns because he ended up fleeing the charges, going back to Lebanon, and then coming back to this country and eventually faced the charges, was convicted and given a prison sentence. But along the line, he tried to make the argument. He said, look, this is where I originate from, the south of Lebanon. It's occupied by the Israelis, and I believe and I support the groups fighting the Israeli occupation. And that's why I did this. And the court, when it got this issue, it said, look, that's fine, and we believe you, but that's not a defense. You either provided the material support and you knew that you were providing it, the material support to what you knew was a foreign terrorist organization, and that's all we need to prove. We don't care what your motivation was, right? So even if you're motivated by what you think is a legitimate and noble concern, Congress didn't in any way show or didn't in any way recognize that this is a defense that's valid. And so, I think, that's a dynamic we have to understand, that the government takes this position. Yeah. And what's engendering so much opposition and so much, protest on university campuses and in the streets as well, just general protest, is the fact that this is such a glaring double standard. I mean, I think there's the legal aspect of it, which is narrow and is subject to kind of the government controlling the narrative and what laws get passed. But there's also the kind of the perception, which is one side is allowed to do whatever it wants, and the other side is deemed kind of inherently terroristic.
Okay, but there is one thing that is quite crucial here, and the United States runs the risk of being outside, so to speak, the international legitimacy and the international consensus. I mean, when you look at some of the UN General Assembly votes, for example, for a ceasefire, 153 countries, and the US is only with a handful of countries, primarily small islands here and there, or some right-wing governments that have elected to stand with them. But the international legitimacy here, the international consensus, is that the Palestinians are being dealt a very violent reaction, and that their human rights and their basic fundamental international law consensus about what constitutes a genocide or ethnic cleansing or apartheid is being exercised by the Israelis, recognized by the general majority of countries in the world. The United States is outside this consensus. Is there any worry on the part of the United States that projects itself as a leader and to a great extent defender of human rights, that it is basically and fundamentally losing that moral high ground, and that people are recognizing that it is really part of the problem, not the solution?
I mean, I think you've seen a lot of the reactions, the outraged reactions to the fact that the United States has behaved in a manner that clearly evidences a double standard, right? And I think the votes in the Security Council were met kind of universally, certainly outside America and its allies, but even within the American context or the European context, the British context. But even then, I think there was a fair degree of criticism about the fact that this was these were steps in, to stop a ceasefire of what is the most horrific conflict I've certainly ever witnessed, right? The most horrific attack, by the Israeli military machine on essentially a civilian population. When they fight actual people on the ground, the results are a bit different. But the attack on Gaza and its civilian population is kind of unprecedented and overt to such a way that people are shocked. And the United States, I think, has taken as a kind of a reputational hit on this. That we are going to be processing and trying to figure out from now on, which, I think anyone who has followed the history of the modern Middle East and the Palestinian issue, the Palestinian question, the Palestinian cause, has recognized the United States has not been a neutral actor here. And to get to your point about international law, the United States has always de-emphasized the role international law should play in resolving the conflict. Because as you mentioned, there are many General Assembly resolutions, but also Security Council resolutions that the United States didn't manage to veto along the way that speak to Palestinian rights and Palestinian self-determination. The United States has never really, never really kind of fully recognized and kind of gives short shrift to at the best of times. And you saw even with the so-called peace process started by the Oslo Accords, but even before that with the Madrid Peace Conference and everything, the role of international law was purposely de-emphasized and kind of put in it kind of lowered in importance to the point where the United States assumed for itself the role of what it called itself a kind of an honest broker, and insisted on being the kind of shepherd of the peace process, which meant that it was going to essentially look out for Israeli interests, ensuring that the process would go nowhere, as we've seen. And I myself personally find that there are holes and gaps and aspects of international law that are deeply unsatisfying when you're talking about a movement for liberation and return. And even with international law's limitations, it still hasn't been accepted by the United States as a basis for negotiations. But now the difference is when you have this incredible level of violence that the Israelis have decided to unleash, coupled with the rhetoric from the United States and the Israelis and their allies, and the fact that they want to stave off any type of international accountability. And in the case of the Security Council, the United States veto is enough to do that, right? That's why the case brought by South Africa is so compelling, because, it's morally compelling, symbolic, the fact that South Africa is bringing the case, not an Arab country. But it's also appealing to a United Nations body that's charged with interpreting international law, which includes the Genocide Convention. And it's not an area where the United States can, at least overtly, we don't know what's going on, of course, behind the scenes. We can't, discuss that or know anything about that. But at least overtly, it can't influence it and veto a decision of the International Court of Justice the same way it can in the Security Council. So this is all, the United States reputation has come under, I think, has taken a huge hit because of this, because of the current situation. And it will, I don't think it's going to, necessarily improve. And one of the kind of difficult things is to read the same kind of statements, positions, about a peace process and two-state solution that don't recognize the reality of what we've experienced, certainly over the last 3.5 months, but even before that.
Sure. No, I have two areas I'd like you to maybe focus a little bit on. First one is the White House has embraced that International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition that conflates criticism of Israel with being anti-Semitic. And that has really become a very sinister type of position to take, because it totally delegitimizes and gives Israel the immunity to carry the kind of vicious and barbaric campaigns that it's waging now. To what extent do we have to see, or what would be the best way to deal with this definition that seems to be accepted in so many places, and yet it is incredibly sinister and quite infringes in a very direct way on the right of people to criticize a action of a state, and the extent to which it gives immunity and shelters Israel from the kind of accountability that it's now able to carry all its activities with impunity.
Okay, well, let me just say, as far as my understanding goes, and this is, of course, a pre-October 7th, 2023 discussion, but the White House had announced earlier last year, 2023, the creation of a task force on anti-Semitism, and it didn't fully embrace, or it didn't adopt officially the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which conflates anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, or criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. But it did say that it was going to be guided by the document. So it was kind of on the one hand, formally, it wasn't recognizing the measure, but kind of informally, it was signaling that, that it was going to pay attention to the idea of criticism of Israel as potentially anti-Semitic. So that was the official position of the White House on this issue. And yes, I mean, the IHRA definition continues to dog us because, as you, I think, aptly stated, right, criticism of a state and its various apparatuses, like, its military, a modern military with an air force that has nuclear weapons, that uses, 2,000-pound bombs on civilian targets, etc., is certainly rife for criticism, I think, by any person of conscience. So being allowed to hold the specter of calling someone who criticizes that state anti-Semitic up is, yes, definitely dangerous. And even the person who wrote the definition said, and has I think his name is Kenneth Stern, who was instrumental in coming up with this definition. He has openly said that he was worried about it being used to delegitimize criticism of Israel as anti-Semitic. And in recent times, he said, look, that's what's happening. And he thinks this is a misuse of the definition. So, I think we have to, understand that this is something that has to be resisted, and the only way to do it is by reasoned argument. Is to insist on a reasoned argument. I'm sure you saw the hearings in Congress of the university presidents, where they were lambasted by certain sections of the press and certain politicians for not condemning calls for what the politicians deemed, one particular politician deemed the calls for the genocide of Jews, right? And the amazing thing was these university presidents didn't challenge the characterization of using the phrase intifada, or calling for an intifada, as genocide of Jews, which of course is not what it means, right? Or saying from the river to the sea is a call for the genocide of Jews, which of course it's not, right? And the way to, it's sometimes very, not sometimes, oftentimes very perplexing and confounding to have to engage in these exercises where one side is saying, well, you're making an argument, but we think your argument is completely illegitimate and violent. And you're trying to say, well, look, I'm making an argument based on facts and based on terminology and based on my understanding and based on what I believe is right and morally and legally, etc. And you're just saying everything I'm saying is just hatred and discrimination. It's hard to find a middle ground there. It's hard to, I think, effectively operate in such a, loaded and charged context, but I think we have to insist on it. There's no other way. To my mind, the big question was, and many people have now written about this, so this is not, I think, an original thought that only I had, but I and many other people, I think, when we watched those hearings and we saw a congressperson say that intifada means a call for the genocide of Jews, and from the river to the sea means a call for the genocide of Jews. None of these university presidents who are, leaders in, higher education, on a worldwide level, none of them were able to say, wait a second, that's not what that means. Wait a second. Do you know Arabic? How can you say that? Wait a second. I don't think that doesn't sound right. And to say, look, of course, the call for genocide of any people is wrong, but your assumptions are faulty. Can you explain why you think these assumptions are legitimate? Because they contradict everything I know. Something like that.
Exactly. This brings me with the Dr. Wadie to three things you have called. Situation, you and I are professors, and we are subjected to the kind of pressures that our students, this is not restricted to students. There is an atmosphere here where any position we take in support of the human right of the Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims is held in question. But you have very specific calls for action on the part of university presidents. Like the first one, you say that at least they should publicly reject the ADL Brandeis letter. And you mentioned a few things. Can you go through these things, and what is the likelihood that these would deal with the issues we're facing on campuses?
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea is that, the call to have the FBI investigate students for material support should be rejected. I mean, that's an obvious one. The other is also for universities to kind of publicly reaffirm their commitment to free speech and advocacy on their campuses, which, sadly, we're not seeing enough of. And I think, the upshot of all this is that while official institutions, whether governments or universities or corporations or whoever it is, what institutions are, while institutions are taking positions in opposition to free discourse and free speech and advocacy and these types of things, people, students, professors, or citizens, etc., in a general sense, are recognizing that this is heavy-handed and oppressive behavior, and it's unfair, and it speaks to a kind of double standard that's untenable, right? Just as a kind of a basic aspect of human existence, right? Nobody accepts the idea that they should be singled out or treated differently based on impermissible factors like their race or their religion or their political opinion, right? So there has been a whole series of, actions, statements, positions that governments and university administrations and et cetera have taken. And the interesting thing is, rather than being chilled, many individuals, especially in the younger kind of sectors of our society, are just refusing to be silenced, which is remarkable because they know that there are costs involved. They know that they can, have their personal information be revealed, their privacy violated, their job opportunities impacted going forward. And yet they still choose to speak out, which is remarkable. And I think that's a break from the past where, individuals could be chilled. I mean, it happened to me when I first was looking for an academic job, and I agonized over whether I should speak out more forcefully. But ultimately, I decided there wasn't that much I could do. Now I think there's a general understanding that many people share these views and are willing to articulate them, and you can draw support. Whereas when I had my issues trying to get a job as a law professor and outside groups were making protesting my candidacy, I didn't feel that there was a network of people or a solidarity movement or a general understanding that would be willing to support me. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I should have made a bigger deal out of it. But this has changed, and I'm certainly heartened to see that repressive measures have not been met with silence and acquiescence.
At this optimistic point here, I'd like to thank Dr. Wadie Saeed for this excellent discourse and analysis. We covered so many areas, and nobody could have covered them in a more competent and a more clearer way than Dr. Wadie. Thank you very much, and look forward that we will see you again in another session of Arabic Hour. This has been a very rich and insightful. And to a great extent, I hope people would listen and understand and review some of the things here. This is a situation that is not just purely intellectual. Some people are losing their jobs. Some people are facing charges. So to a great extent, what we've covered here is of important and very significant for our people, especially those who watch this program. There is a lot to learn, and there is a lot to use. And thank you very much, Dr. Wadie, for being with us, and we will see you soon.
Okay, thank you very much for having me. Thank you.